tonight I'm going to talk about my dissertation project, which was assessing the effects of cattle grazing on semi-ancient wood pasture within Kielder Forest. It was based on an existing experiment by Forestry England. So, a little bit of background. Traditional wood pastures once formed an integral part of our forest management, however are threatened through abandonment and intensive agriculture. They are maintained through the use of light grazing, very slow to mature, and contain a mosaic of habitats rich in biodiversity, which can contain woodland, grassland, heathland and scrub. And grazing is known to help maintain and enhance these habitats. Grazing is now widely recognised as a tool for conservation and is utilised by many different conservation organisations. It can create benefits of both biodiversity and forest management. So, very famously, it's known in wilding projects such as the Oostvaardersplassen in the Netherlands, and if any of you have read Isabella Tree's Wilding for NEP, which was the 3,500-acre estate, which took a radical restoration process from being an intensive farm to a process led by large grazing herbivores, which seen huge successes in biodiversity and rare species. So the integration of livestock creates disturbance through not only grazing but trampling, rootling and rubbing. It can be a great tool for linking fragmented habitats. So what little ancient woodland we have left tends to be isolated in small little pockets, so grazing can be used to help disperse it and spread it out, obviously in very light forms. So it can result in a much more varied and complex habitat, aiding seed dispersal, adding nutrients and creating openings. And obviously there's a lot of research that also promotes the use of grazing to induce species richness as well as species diversity. However, considerations do need to be taken into account. Stocking rate and grazing type can be really difficult to get right. A lot of factors need to be considered in terms of the habitat and location, any designations on the land, and what species are currently present. Too much grazing pressure will reduce or inhibit species diversity. It can also cause nutrient enrichment and compaction, which will reduce the amount of species that can survive there, especially a lot of our flowering species. Too little can lead to scrub encroachment. Some scrub encroachment is great, that's exactly what we want. Too much will eventually lead to a closed canopy forest, reducing the species that we have that are dependent on more open habitats. There is guidelines to go off for landowners depending on stocking rate. However, when there is a mosaic of habitats, this can be really difficult to gauge. So it's advised that we start off low with continued monitoring. The use of traditional native breeds can also create further benefits for landowners. So this is an image of some longhorn cattle from NEP. Some of the benefits for these hardy breeds is that you can keep them outdoors all year round, so there's no need for a barn for overwinter, and the use of additional feeds to provide extra food. And they're pretty much self-sufficient, so they can be just left with little maintenance. As well as the advantages of having trees in amongst the pasture as well will create shelter for overwinter and shade for over summer. This type of farming can be seen as high-value nature farming. And there are agri-environment schemes to benefit landowners wanting to farm in this way. But it can be a difficult transition especially if farmers have a lot of cattle or a lot of produce. So, a little introduction to my project. The aim was to determine the effects of grazing for the introduction of cattle at Pasture semi-ancient wood pasture, and to establish if the addition of cattle has been beneficial to the ground flora, soil and wood pasture condition between 2010 to 2022. My objectives were to repeat the botanical recording methods that were previously implemented, to then try and enhance upon this data, to assess the woodland structure, conduct soil sampling, and then analyse and interpret the data to fully understand the effects. So here we have a map of the location. The site is located within the northern region of Kielder Forest. in Northumberland, as shown in the map here. And here we have an aerial view of the project site. The boundary line is shown in red, and it's been partially fenced to allow a direct comparison between grazed and ungrazed sites. And there's 4 different treatment areas. At the bottom we have the grazed grassland, then the grazed woodland, and the ungrazed woodland and the ungrazed grassland. The cattle grazing was applied in 2009 with 4 free-roaming cattle. The cattle are sementals, so they were removed over winter due to the breed not being hard enough to be kept out all year round. And then surveys were conducted in 2010 and 2015. I forgot what I was saying. In 2010 and 2015. And then data was analysed by Sarah White in 2020. From that, no significance was found within there was an improvement within woodland quality, however, it wasn't deemed significant, so recommendations were for future surveys. So my first task was to repeat the botanical surveys. I first visited the site in the winter, and it's a fantastic site full of mosses and lichens. Absolutely loved surveying up there. I located all the grid references using GPS. I conducted 2 by 2 metre quadrats, exactly as was done in 2010 and 2015, using day4. So I recorded all species present, recording them as either dominant, abundant, frequent or rare. Here are some examples of some of the quadrats that I recorded. And I also collected soil samples from each of those 16 quadrats. So from my initial visits in the winter, there didn't seem to be that big of an impact from the cattle. However, when we went back in the spring, I was really surprised at how big an impact 4 cattle could make to the site. There was a lot of areas of turned up ground, lots of evidence of poaching, there was pathways throughout the woodland, and there was a clear contrast within the grassland areas. So grazed areas appear to have a much more even distribution of species and a lot more flowering plants, compared to ungrazed areas, which had large swards dominated by far fewer species. There were large swards of bracken, large swards of reed, canary and tussock grasses. There was a real noticeable difference, especially the grassland. But also within the woodland, there was a lot more flowering species. There was lots of yellow pimpernel, oppositely golden saxifrage, dog violets, a lot more flowering species, where compared to the ungrazed woodland, it seemed darker, denser, a lot more grassy, a lot of creeping soft grass. So it was evident that the cattle had definitely made an impact. And both woodlands were rich in mosses, which was lovely to see. With Phoidium tamarasculum being most dominant throughout, lots of polytrichum, lots of sphagnum mosses. There were fantastic sites, but a clear contrast between them. So to then enhance this data, my original plan was to do MVC classification, to classify the habitats. After seeing a lot of the mosses, I thought top and bottom pin drop method, which is basically where you drop a pin in amongst each of these little squares and you record the first and the last species it hits. I thought that may be more accurate for recording change over time, but after spending a day trialling both methods, I decided what was really needed was more quadrats. Time was a real constraint with this project, so instead I've said to go back and enhance the number of quadrats to 32 2 by 2 metre quadrats, and I recorded them using day4, exactly what was done in 2010 and 2015, as well as doming, just to enhance it and to add to the data for future surveys. So the forest structure, my initial plan was to record tree heights using a clinometer and measure width at breast height. However, all of the trees were in leaf when I arrived, and also there were many fallen trees from Storm Arwen. I did create my own transects, scoring the canopy from 1 to 10, 1 being completely open to 10 being completely closed. However, I felt like most of the light-filled areas were mainly due to fallen trees rather than the impact of the cattle alone. The cattle had clearly made an impact within the forest. As you can see in this picture here, there were pathways and broken branches, and it was definitely lighter, though I didn't feel it was fair to judge the impact of the cattle purely alone, so I had to remove that from the study. So the soil samples were taken from each of the original grid references, 4 cores collected from each quadrat and combined. These were air-dried in the lab and ground and sieved. I tested pH, conductivity, NPK, which is potassium, phosphorus and nitrogen, and organic content, and then conducted data analysis to compare the presence of grazing and habitat type to determine the effect on the floral communities. The pH results were consistent. However, again, another time constraint, ideally I would have liked to have collected more samples, at least from the 32 quadrats. I think these would give more consistent results with the soil, as the rest of the soil results were very varied. So my initial botanical results were really positive. This is a bar chart to show species richness. As you can see from here, from 2010 to 2022, we had significant increases in species richness, with 230 species being recorded in ungrazed and 325 in grazed areas, which is fantastic. Exactly what we would hope to see. And just here, a little bit more information. So these are three-way box plots. And the first one shows species richness, the second shows species diversity, and the third shows ancient woodland indicators. So ancient woodland indicators can be a good tool at assessing ancient woodland quality, not always solely by themselves, but because we had baseline data to go off, we were able to see if the habitat had improved with grazing or decreased. So the red shows obviously from 2010, the green 2015, and the yellow 2022. Let me just go on. So in the species richness, so a big 78% increase in species richness within the woodland, and a 90% increase within the grassland from 2010 to 2022. Also significant increases within species diversity. So how I mentioned there was yellow pimpernel within the grazed areas and not within the ungrazed. That's a species which particularly likes disturbed ground, which is why it was found within grazed areas and not within the ungrazed. And the ancient woodland indicator saw a huge 169% increase, specifically within the grazed woodland, compared to the ungrazed site. And interestingly as well, within the grassland, the ancient woodland indicators had decreased, so that supports exactly what we saw, where there was large swaths of grasses dominating the areas, and it left little pockets of the flowering species, and I believe that will continue to decrease over time without any intervention. So this is the results from the enhanced data, which is from the 32 quadrats over a larger case of the site. So again, we had significant results of species richness in grazed areas compared to ungrazed. Species diversity this time wasn't significant, but the mean results were still higher in grazed areas compared to ungrazed. And ancient woodland indicators this time had a massive 188% increase within the grazed woodland. So again, excellent results, exactly what we would hope to find. The pH results also just help to give us a little bit more information about the site as a whole. And as there was previously no soil samples conducted, it's good to have some baseline data to go off. So all of the results were acidic, ranging from 3.4 to 5.9. pH was highest in the grazed, most species-rich areas, bar one result, and it was lowest in the ungrazed, least species-rich areas. And this just supports a lot of the research I was looking at, suggested that grazed sites generally have higher species richness and were maximised on sites of higher soil pH. So again, just tells us a lot more and was what we were hoping to find. So overall, the addition of cattle at Pastures in Northumberland had a really positive effect within the wood pasture, not only visually, but the data analysis also signifies the positive difference in species richness, species diversity and ancient woodland indicators. This time the forest structure was unable to be recorded, but that's something which could again be looked at in the future. The pH levels again support this, and the enhanced botanical data further supports the effect of cattle grazing. But what does need to be considered is that limitations obviously do lie within the existing criteria, timescale and project size to just this experiment. So given more time, ideally it would have been useful to compare this to other grazing sites and similar experiments, and obviously the objectivity and skills of the surveyor. So everybody that surveys has a slightly different objectivity in terms of percentage cover, and I could have been more thorough than the previous surveys or vice versa. So that is something to consider. And just to conclude, I think it's really important, especially at the time of climate collapse and huge biodiversity losses, to find management methods that will help this. So traditionally managed wood pastures are of high conservation value and provide considerable benefits to biodiversity. And hopefully these results demonstrate how cattle grazing can be an effective, sustainable management method for the conservation of ancient semi-natural wood pastures. And just to say thank you to Tom Durnley, who facilitated this experiment on behalf of Forestry England, my tutors Helen Adamson and Janet Simpkin, who were amazing and gave me so much support throughout my course, the tenant farmer Ray and his cattle, and Ellie Coleman for asking me to do this and write the article. I never would have been brave enough had you not asked, so thank you.